Hello and welcome to Baiju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a few important articles related to the ongoing climate change summit. See, the 26th Conference of Parties to the Climate Change Convention is going on this week at Glasgow in the United Kingdom, and the developments that take place at this summit is going to be very important for your exams. So there are going to be multiple articles throughout the week, and we shall cover all of them in order to keep a close track of these developments, which are crucial for your prelims and as well as for your mains. Today, we shall focus on some of the important initiatives that have been taken up at COP26 and also discuss the key initiatives being taken up by India. First, global leaders have pledged to launch the Global Methane Pledge in order to significantly bring down methane emissions. This initiative, known as the Global Methane Pledge, was first launched by the US and European Union in September. And after they proposed the initiative at COP26, more than 90 countries have signed on to it, along with major emitters of methane such as Brazil. Through this initiative, known as the Global Methane Pledge, the US and the European Union, along with the 90 other countries, are planning to reduce methane emissions by 30% from 2020 levels by the year 2030. This is the target that they have pledged to achieve in order to bring down methane emissions and help the world tackle the impact of climate change. See, methane is the second most abundant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere after carbon dioxide. It's a major greenhouse gas because its global warming potential is 80 times higher than the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. Meaning, one molecule of methane in the atmosphere can cause 80 times more heating of the atmosphere as compared to one molecule of carbon dioxide. But fortunately, the shelf life of methane in the atmosphere is less because methane molecules are known to remain in the atmosphere for just around 12 years as compared to hundreds of years, which is the atmospheric shelf life of carbon dioxide. Hence, it is carbon dioxide which is the top contributor to global warming, because even though the global warming potential of CO2 is lesser as compared to methane, it remains for a longer duration in the atmosphere, that is for hundreds of years, thereby causing more heating and warming. Whereas methane molecules, even though they have 80 times more global warming potential than CO2, their atmospheric shelf life is very less, hardly around 12 years. And this makes them the second most potent greenhouse gas. See, methane is released into the atmosphere through natural sources as well, such as through wetlands, forest fires, volcanoes, etc. But anthropogenic activities by humans has added to methane concentration in the atmosphere, and it has made it the second most dominant greenhouse gas. Anthropogenic sources of methane emission includes the oil and gas production industry, contributes significantly to emissions of methane during the extraction of fossil fuels. Mining of coal, extraction of shale gas, coal bed methane, and even natural gas is set to release methane into the atmosphere, which in turn contributes to the heating of the atmosphere. Then agriculture and animal husbandry is also a major contributor of methane emissions because cultivation of water intensive crops such as paddy results in methane emissions as water is kept stagnant in the field, which allows for decomposition of organic matter, similar to the process seen in natural wetlands, which ends up releasing methane into the atmosphere. Then the rearing of ruminant category of livestock, such as cows and buffaloes, also releases large amounts of methane into the atmosphere, which directly contributes to climate change and global warming. Then the urban landfills, where the urban waste is disposed, also releases a lot of methane, mainly due to partial decomposition. And even the activity of treating wastewater releases methane into the atmosphere. So these anthropogenic sources have contributed significantly to the rising concentration of methane in the atmosphere, and hence around 90 countries led by US and European Union have taken a pledge to bring down these emissions by 30% from 2020 levels by the year 2030. By employing changes in these industrial processes and by deploying the right kind of technology, methane emissions can be brought down. but it will require significant investments in the right kind of technology. So, considering the cost of this transition, major emitters of methane, such as China, India, and Russia, are yet to decide on the pledge and they are yet to sign up. Whereas Australia, on the other hand, has made it clear that it won't be a part of this global pledge to bring down methane emissions. Next, during COP26, the Glasgow leaders have adopted a declaration on forests and land use. This declaration primarily focuses on halting and reversing deforestation and land degradation by the year 2030. More than 100 countries have signed up for this initiative, and they have proposed to establish a $19 billion fund by drawing investments from both public and private sources so that small developing nations can be assisted by the 12 major countries which are looking to contribute $12 billion together. And between the period 2021 to 2025, this finance would be delivered to developing nations by the developed countries so that they can take measures by the end of the decade to completely halt deforestation and to even reverse deforestation, and as well as to halt and reverse land degradation by promoting better land use practices. This Glasgow Leaders Declaration is seen as an expansion of the 2014 New York Declaration on Forests, which had earlier aimed to bring down deforestation by 50% by 2020 and to end deforestation by 2030. This New York Declaration had been adopted by nearly 40 countries, and now, through the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest Degradation and Land Use, the targets have been upgraded, and through a financing arrangement of $19 billion from developed nations to developing nations, more than 100 countries are planning to end deforestation and to reverse land degradation. India, however, is yet to formally sign this initiative, but India does have similar targets with regard to deforestation and land degradation as a part of its intended nationally determined contributions, or the voluntary targets that we have announced under the Paris Agreement. Under the voluntary targets of Paris Agreement, India has committed to create an additional carbon sink which can absorb 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide by 2030. Despite this ambitious voluntary target, India is yet to formally sign up to the New York Declaration on Forests, and hence it has not formally committed to the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use. But however, these targets and commitments of India could change through the week as the negotiations continue at the Climate Change Summit, and hence we need to closely track these developments in order to exactly understand what initiatives, what targets, and what announcements are going to be made by India. Next, India has announced a new initiative known as IRIS, which stands for Infrastructure for Resilient Island States. If you remember, just a couple of days ago, we had spoken about this initiative, and India has launched this in cooperation with Australia and the United Kingdom. These three countries have taken up the IRIS initiative under the CDRI, or the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which had been launched earlier by India in 2019 to promote the creation of disaster resilient infrastructure in the light of increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, which are being driven by climate change and global warming. So under the CDRI, India has tied up with Australia and UK and launched IRIS to help out the small island states that are located in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, in the Caribbean region, and the others, because these small island states are the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change and global warming. As the polar ice caps start melting and as the glaciers recede, it results in rising levels of seawater, which is going to submerge many of these small island nations, and this makes them highly vulnerable to the impact of climate change. They are going to face more and more extreme weather events such as cyclones, heavy floods, etc. And this would be highly unfortunate for the small island nations because they have hardly contributed to climate change. And hence, the developed nations and the large nations and the industrialized countries are taking up the responsibility to help out these small island states. So India, Australia, UK have launched the IRIS initiative to provide the required funding and technology so that these small island states can create disaster resilient infrastructure, which will help these countries adapt to the reality of climate change. While launching the initiative, Prime Minister Modi has said that India's ISRO has developed advanced early warning systems and even weather monitoring and tracking systems, which is being offered by India to these small island states as a part of the IRIS initiative. Such early warning, forecasting, and monitoring services will help in making these small island states more resilient towards disasters and extreme weather events, thus helping in reducing their vulnerability to climate change. India, Australia, and the UK are going to pool in their financial resources along with their technological expertise to help in the creation of disaster resilient infrastructure in these small island nations. Then, during the negotiations at COP26, India has demanded the developed nations to hike the climate finance that they had committed to. See, back in 2009, developed and industrialized nations had committed to arrange or raise $100 billion every year, which was supposed to be provided to the developing nations which are part of the global south. This promised funding is yet to be realized, and hence India has demanded that the developed nations should take up their responsibilities and should further increase their pledge from $100 billion to $1 trillion because the announcements made back in 2009 may not be sufficient to help the smaller developing nations of the global south to shield and protect themselves against the impact of climate change. India has raised this demand while addressing a gathering of like-minded developing countries, and it has used the platform to remind the developed nations that first they have to fulfill their commitment made in 2009 that they would start providing $100 billion every year from 2020. And upon that, since this funding may not be sufficient, they will have to consider hiking climate finance to $1 trillion to assist the developing and smaller nations of the global south to implement mitigation and adaptation measures in their respective countries. Then finally, India along with the United Kingdom have launched the ambitious Green Grids Initiative, or also known as One Sun, One World, One Grid Initiative. This initiative aims to exploit the solar potential of like-minded countries in order to scale up their investments in renewable energy and to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. And it also aims to create large-scale power infrastructure to promote the cross-border trade or transfer of electricity that is generated through renewable sources such as solar. This is seen as an extension of India's ambitious International Solar Alliance, which is already backed by more than 120 countries. And through the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative, India along with the UK are planning to create large-scale global-level solar grids so that electricity generated through solar power can be transferred across continents. India aims to interconnect the power grids of South Asia and provide for free cross-border trade of electricity generated through solar sources. Then we plan to interconnect these grids with Southeast Asian countries, along with countries in Central Asia, West Asia, Africa, and even with Europe. So the plan is to create an ambitious grid that can rival China's investments in the Belt and Road Initiative in order to provide for seamless transfer of electricity and energy generated through solar sources from one region to another by creating these continental scale power grids. This initiative is being backed by several research institutions as well, including the Oxford and Cambridge. And it is also being supported by several financial institutions, including the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the African Development Bank. As of now, more than 80 countries have supported India and the UK in launching the Green Grids initiative. And with India's leadership, there is a proposal to expand the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative to create a global super grid which will help in the seamless movement of renewable energy. Under the initiative, India is planning to play a lead role and has even developed technological solutions for this purpose. India's ISRO has developed an application which can precisely compute the solar potential of any region on Earth. And this information could be useful for other countries when they are planning solar energy projects to check and verify whether those projects can be financially viable. And through such technological and financial assistance, India is planning to play a lead role, along with the United Kingdom, in championing the Green Grids Initiative or the One Sun, One World, One Grid initiative. Now let's look at the 5 new targets that has been announced by Prime Minister Modi at the 26th Conference of Parties to the Climate Change Summit. See, before leaving for the summit, India had made it clear that it won't be taking up net zero emission targets. But now it appears that India has taken up a commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2070, which means that by 2070, India's carbon emissions will be offset by taking out or removing equivalent carbon from the atmosphere so that the net emissions in balance is zero. So, along with this new target of achieving net zero emissions by 2070, the Prime Minister has also announced 4 more new targets. But we are yet to get complete clarity on these new targets as the negotiations are still ongoing and India is yet to announce its new and updated INDC targets under the Paris Agreement. Once India officially comes out with the revised and updated targets, the specifics will become clear, and then we are likely to get better clarity on what new commitments has been made by India. But as things stand currently, 5 new targets have been announced by the Prime Minister, which includes achieving net zero emissions by 2070, along with 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. Previously, under the voluntary targets of Paris Agreement, India had committed for the installation of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. But now this has been increased and India plans to have an installed capacity of 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. Then within this deadline, India wants to ensure that at least 50% of its energy is coming from renewable sources. That's the 3rd new target that has been highlighted by the Prime Minister. And through these initiatives, India is planning to reduce its carbon emissions by 1 billion tons by the end of the decade and reduce the carbon intensity of its economy to less than 45% so that we can eventually achieve net zero emissions by 2070. But achieving net zero and reducing emission intensity would mean that India would also have to announce a peaking year. That is the year in which India would hit its peak emissions, after which there would be a sustained fall in India's emissions. While these renewed targets and new commitments announced by India are bold and appreciable, they do present significant challenges to the Indian economy, according to several experts. Next, in a related column on page number 8, the writers argue that trade and climate change relations can become the true pivot for the India-US relations. The writers point out that the current India-US relationship is largely centered around their strategic and defense relations, which is aimed at containing the rising threat posed by an aggressive China. While this factor has brought India and US closer in the strategic and defense domain, and even as they continue to build stronger defense relations, extending to counterterrorism, joint military exercises, and sale of weapons, the strategic relationship will never be truly complete without further building on the trade relations between India and US, which is directly related to their initiatives on climate change. See, in the domain of climate change, India and US are already collaborating with each other, and they have even established the Climate and Clean Energy Agenda Partnership. Through such platforms, they are looking to work together in the field of climate change and clean energy, and progress on this front will directly result in progress in the trading relations between the two countries as well, because climate change issues related to transfer of technology, mitigation, and climate finance can trigger trade wars between India and US, and such instability in the trading relationship will also destabilize the strategic relations. So the writers are arguing that if India and US want to truly strengthen their strategic partnership, then they should give the same focus to trade and climate as well as they give to defense relations. And they need to chart a long-term strategy to avoid issues and conflict in the trade and climate domain, because that could easily spill over into the broader relationship and even threaten to affect their strategic relations. Next, we have a column on page number 8, which examines the plight of Indian migrant workers in the West Asia region or in the Gulf region. See, in the Gulf region, represented by the GCC or the Gulf Cooperation Council, there are millions of Indians who reside and work in these countries, such as Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. As you can see in this image, according to data from 2016, millions of Indians were residing and working in the GCC countries. As per latest estimates, these numbers have gone up to around 9 to 10 million Indians residing and working in the Gulf countries, and a majority of them happen to be blue collar workers, with a small percentage of white collar workers. See, blue collared workers are those who are semi skilled or unskilled and often take up routine, low paying jobs in order to establish a livelihood for themselves in these countries. Then, white collared jobs are taken up by the more skilled professionals, and this includes medical professionals such as nurses and even engineers who form the backbone of the construction and oil industry in the Gulf region. But however, majority of the Indians who travel to these countries for work are semi-skilled or unskilled, and they take up blue-collared jobs, whereas a very small percentage of them take up white-collared jobs. So these Indians who are residing and working in the Gulf region constitute the Indian diaspora, and they are playing a key role in Indian diplomacy. They not only act as India's cultural ambassadors in these countries, but they're also sending back precious remittances, which is of immense help to the Indian economy. But these Indian workers who work in the Gulf region, they have been facing several challenges, and these challenges have been further aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. See, especially the blue collared workers who are semi skilled or unskilled, they are often subjected to a lot of abuse and exploitation in these countries. The impact of this is disproportionately borne by women migrant workers from India, as they happen to be more vulnerable while working in these countries. These workers, especially women workers, they are often duped by middlemen while arranging their visas and travel arrangements. They often extract huge sums of money from them while finding jobs for them in these countries. And after great difficulty, even if they manage to find a job, they often face abusive, exploitative conditions where they are often paid very low salaries or sometimes no salaries at all. And the employers are known to confiscate their passports. And in many cases, they exceed the time limits and violate the visa conditions, thus making them legally vulnerable in a foreign country. The workers are given very poor working conditions and accommodation, and there is even a lack of social security benefits. There have also been many cases where women workers have been taken to be employed as domestic help and maids, but quite often they are even pushed into prostitution and into trafficking. Then many women workers are also duped in the name of marriage, and they are often pushed into forceful labor or exploitative labor where they are made to work as domestic helps and maids with very poor salaries and with very poor working and employment conditions. So these challenges faced by Indian workers in the Middle East, especially the challenges faced by women migrant workers, has gone up significantly ever since the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. And the writers present these challenges faced by the women workers by taking relevant examples and case studies. So keeping their concerns in mind, they're calling upon the Indian government to leverage its close diplomatic relations with these Gulf countries and to ensure that a mechanism is put in place to create a gender centric, rights based safeguard mechanism which can protect the rights of women workers in these countries. According to data from the International Labour Organization, there are nearly 23 million foreign workers in the Gulf region, and out of them, nearly 39% are women workers. ILO data shows that majority of these women migrant workers come from South Asia and Southeast Asia, and a large number of them happen to be Indian women. So in order to protect them against such abuse and exploitative practices, and in order to safeguard their working, labor and welfare rights, India will have to work with these Gulf countries to create a gender-centric, rights-based safeguard mechanism, especially considering the job losses and wage losses that have been caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now let's look at this article from page number 1. The National Human Rights Commission has directed the Ministry of Home Affairs and the state governments to establish the Police Complaints Authority as recommended by the Supreme Court in its landmark judgment in the Prakash Singh case of 2006. See, this case is seen as a landmark case with regard to police reforms, as the Supreme Court laid down 7 binding directives in the historic Prakash Singh case. Prakash Singh, a former DGP, had approached the Supreme Court seeking directions to introduce police reforms so that our police forces could be made more professional and accountable while improving the service conditions of the police forces. After looking into this case, the Supreme Court invoked its powers under Article 142 and issued directives to the center and the state, calling for a complete overhaul of the Indian Police Act of 1861, which is of colonial era. The Supreme Court called for a complete revision of this outdated law, and through these 7 binding directives, the Supreme Court sought to provide immunity and autonomy to the police forces from the executive and especially the politicians in order to counter the excessive politicization of our police forces. Then through these 7 binding directives, the Supreme Court is trying to cast away the colonial hangover of this law and to make the Indian policing system more citizen friendly and curb any excesses and violations being committed by the police in the spirit of introducing wide sweeping police reforms. These 7 binding directives were supposed to be implemented by the respective state governments by passing appropriate laws, along with subsequent changes being made by the center. These 7 binding directives of the Prakash Singh case includes the establishment of a state security commission to ensure that the state government, that is the political executive, does not exercise unwarranted influence or pressure on the state police force and over its functioning. Second, to ensure that the DGP of the state, who is the highest ranking police officer in the state, is appointed through a merit-based transparent process by guaranteeing a minimum tenure of 2 years in order to protect the integrity of the police chief so that he can freely take decisions without any uncertainty over his tenure and by purely relying on his merit during selection. Next, the Supreme Court called for a minimum tenure of 2 years for all police officers who are on operational duties so that the politicization of the police force can be prevented, as the political class has weaponized the tool of transfers to keep the police force under their control. Next, the Supreme Court called for a separation of investigation and law and order functions of the police to introduce more professionalism in the police force and to make them more effective in investigation and in maintenance of law and order, because both are specialized functions and the Supreme Court sought to draw a clear boundary between the two. Next, it called for the establishment of a police establishment board to decide on transfers, postings and promotions and other service related matters at the state level. Then sixth, the Supreme Court recommended the establishment of the Police Complaints Authority, which is currently in news. And these complaint authorities were supposed to be set up at the state and district level so that the public can file complaints against police officers in case of any excesses being committed by them. This measure was suggested to hold the police force accountable for any violations of human rights that they might commit, and to give an opportunity to the public to raise their voice and to file complaints against police officers when they are subjected to any form of harassment by the police forces. Then finally, the Supreme Court directed the center to establish the National Security Commission for preparing a panel of officers for selection and appointment as the chiefs to the central police organizations. Out of these 7 binding directives, very few have been implemented by the center and the state governments, whereas the 6th directive has been largely missed by most of the states. So in this regard, the NHRC has directed the MHA and the state governments to establish the Police Complaints Authority as it was mandated by the Supreme Court so that the police forces can be held accountable for their violations and thus provide for the fulfillment of a key aspect of police reforms. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: illustrate the key initiatives announced by India during COP26 summit at Glasgow. The second question: examine the plight of Indian migrant workers in West Asia with special emphasis on the challenges faced by women workers. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.